Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Danielson, and I'm a member of the NCACES webinar committee. So welcome. On behalf of NCACES, I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar on grief and the supervisory triad, acknowledging an elephant in the room. We're so glad that you could be here and appreciate your support of NCACES. I just want to go over a few things before we get started. First, during the webinar, you can interact with our presenter by using the tools on your screen, such as the chat box. If you have any issues during the webinar with technology, try logging out of Zoom and logging back in, as sometimes this fixes some of those glitchy issues. For those of you who are interested in receiving CEs for the presentation, there's just a few things I want to let you know, and I will put this in the chat box as well, so it's okay if you don't remember, I'll put it in there as well. But participants who are present for the full webinar are eligible for CEs. You will receive a short survey via email to complete related to this webinar. Usually this happens within about a week of the webinar. Then after our CE coordinator receives your survey, you'll receive your CE certificate via email. The entire process usually takes between 1 and 2 weeks. So just be mindful that today you won't be receiving your CE certificate. It will take about 1 to 2 weeks. Finally, we have a lot of really great webinars coming up that I hope that you can all join. So stay up to date on our NCACES website. Again, I'll include that information in the chat box, or you can go through the NCACES social media pages to see what those are. If you have any questions about any of this, feel free to reach out to us at northcentralaces@gmail.com. I will put that in. And without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. So today we have Kailey Bradley with us, and apparently my cat Jake. Kailey earned her Bachelor's of Arts from Mount Vernon Nazarene University in 2012 and finished her master's in clinical mental health counseling in Ashland Theological Seminary in 2015. Kailey is a licensed professional clinical counselor with supervisory designation in the state of Ohio and is a board certified counselor. Kailey also received the certification of Thanatonology. All right.
You were close. You got it. Yeah.
Wonderful. From ABEC. Kailey has a background in hospice work and feels that compassioning and advocating for grievers is her life's passion. Her goal through her trainings, groups, and individual counseling sessions is to create a refuge where the normal plethora of emotions of grief are normalized and accepted as valid. Kailey specializes in working with individuals of all ages with special interest and care given to children's bereavement, complicated grief, prenatal loss, and chronic illness. She's worked 4.5 years at local hospice agency and provided over 50 workshops and trainings on grief throughout her current career thus far. Kailey also has conducted over 100 grief support groups and has a passion for research on methods and strategies for offering creative and engaging bereavement support groups for children. Currently, she's an adjunct professor at Ashland Theological Seminary, where she teaches grief and crisis counseling courses. Kailey is also currently a doctoral student at Ohio University, studying counselor education and supervision. She also co-owns Refuge Counseling, LCC, a private practice specializing in intersections of grief, sexuality, and spirituality. So welcome, everyone. Welcome, Kailey, and we look forward to hearing some information.
Hello there. Sorry, I am having a little difficulty with my camera, but I am here. And as we start, I will kind of fight with that a little bit and get that to cooperate. It is completely on my end, so I apologize for that. But so glad to see you all today and talk about what I hope will be maybe a unique, topic, a unique intersection. So as we get started, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. All right. Okay. So as Jessica was kind enough to introduce, I am a licensed professional clinical counselor, thanatologist, and a doctoral student in counselor ed and supervision, as well as an adjunct professor. So again, thank you so much for having me. But I would love to hear from folks before we do our moment of kind of grounding. What brings you here today? What, I am so sorry, guys, technical issues. So I'm going to stop the share for a second. Okay. I would love to hear from folks when you saw that there was a potential training on grief and supervision. What brought you here? A Friday afternoon, a grief webinar. There's probably lots of spaces that you could be. Lots of busy schedules, I know. So I would love to hear maybe from a few folks. What brought you to the training today? Okay, Claudia says I was interested in the intersection of grief and supervision. Okay. Anything in particular, Claudia, that you were interested in as far as that intersection? She says, not sure. Okay, well, that's all right. Anyone else, real quick? I feel like we don't talk about this enough in counselor and supervision. Yep. William says, I'm interested in addressing shame in supervision. Interesting. Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. Awesome. Grief touches most clients on the lifespan. Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. Awesome. All right. So thank you for indulging me in that. I always am just curious what brings people. So here's a couple of overarching ideas, kind of a game plan as to where we're going today. Okay. So I'm going to make the case today that supervision can function as a protective umbrella against disenfranchised grief. And if that term is unfamiliar to you, that is okay. We're going to define it here shortly. All right. So yes, I will provide some definitions, examples of what disenfranchised grief looks like, some specific kind of case studies with that. And for purposes of this training, how that could show up in the supervision context. And then I'm going to give some practical suggestions for how to kind of embody this protective umbrella metaphor. Okay. So I don't know about you guys, but I always feel like I want to walk away from a training with a few practical things that I can use tomorrow, so to speak. Okay. So they're going to be some pretty straightforward practical suggestions that we will be providing. Okay. All right. We already kind of touched on that. So before we really dig into this intersection of grief and supervision, I would love to hear from you guys. I just want to do an activity, a word association about grief. What comes to mind when you hear the word grief? There are no right or wrong answers, okay? So you can either blurt them out, put it in the chat, and these can be different feelings you might experience, specific examples. Oh, you guys are quick. Oh my goodness, look at all of this. You guys are already putting them in there. These are great. Sadness, okay. Pain, darkness, complicated, yeah. Your life is on hold, loss and shame, hopelessness, powerlessness, sadness, confusion. Yeah, these are all great. Exhaustion, long-lasting, chaos, okay. Excellent. All right. You guys were really quick. All right. Okay. So I want to show a brief video here to kind of ground us with this question. Why does this topic matter? Why is it important to talk about grief? Okay. So got a video here that's simply called Let's Talk About Grief to kind of make the argument that it is actually a topic worthwhile. Okay. So I'm going to get that ready for us. Okay. All right. You guys, let me know if you can see this video. Can you guys see this okay? Yes, beautiful. All right.
There's so much individual experience in this life. There are so many different varieties of relationship and family and community. The one thing we are always going to have in common is that it hurts to lose the people we love.
My granddaughter.
My mother.
My sister and my dad.
Everybody you meet is going through something.
My daddy.
They're dealing with something. They're losing someone.
My son.
Grief is natural and normal. All of us do it, but oftentimes we say, oh, this feels too uncomfortable. I don't want to feel this. And we don't leave spaces for real responses. Suppressing grief, leaving it in the corner where we never talk about it unless we're forced to, that has created an epidemic of unspoken grief in this culture.
We know that in general, people who experience the death of a loved one can still go on to lead very happy, healthy lives. We also know that without appropriate support or enough support, that can be very difficult. So the social support piece really becomes critically important.
Most people have really good intentions and they really want to support their person. The problem is that we're taught the wrong ways to be of help. Grief work is about humanity. It's about the work that we do to create a real safe environment for all of us to do the work of loving, to do the work of losing. It's about the work that we do on being more human.
My ex-husband.
My twin sons.
My dad.
My stepdad.
My son.
My dad.
My cousin.
My babies.
If we want the kind of culture where we feel cared for inside our deepest pain, and we feel capable and confident in caring for our people's pain, our friends, our family members' pain, then we need to open these conversations about grief. They're really conversations about love.
All right. I chose that video because I think it's a good starting off point for today. Any quick, I know this hour goes quick, but any quick comments that you want to throw in the chat or blurt out? What did we think of that quick little video? Any thoughts? No pressure either. And my camera finally started working. Hello, friends. Good deal. Claudia says she loved the message of responding with love. William says we all go through trauma. Yeah, I think those are really, really great pieces to pull out of that video. Yeah, good. I like the reframe of grief being about love. I like that too. Absolutely. Okay. All right. Moving along. Okay. So I'm making the argument that it's important that we talk about grief, right? Because we all experience it. However, as counselor educators and supervisors, we have a little bit of a challenge because there is a lack of consistent, I'll say, grief counseling course requirements, okay? KCREP, our standard, says we should be talking about grief, death, and dying, but often grief courses are sporadically offered, okay? And if they are, they're typically standalone electives, right? So there's this sense that we're supposed to, as counselor educators and supervisors, be talking about grief and loss, but I don't think we're really set up well to do that because we don't have sufficient training, right? And resources, okay? Again, there's a lack of consistency, often offered again as kind of sporadic standalone electives, okay? I'd be curious, and there's no pressure, if folks in your program, if you're counselor educators, if there is a grief counseling elective at your program, I'd be curious if you want to put that in the chat, just my own kind of curiosity, okay? So the question we're kind of talking about today is, are counselor educators and supervisors equipped to handle what I call the elephant in the room, and that's grief, okay? what do we do if we're not getting adequate training and grief enters the space of supervision, right? How are we able then to help our supervisees? And thus, how are our supervisees and students able to help their future clients, right? It's this triadic relationship, and it all gets impacted, I think, when we're not talking about grief and supervision. Just going to pause for a second because it looks like some stuff in the chat. Yeah, grief inevitably comes up, but there's no course. Okay, William says we teach crisis and trauma and grief and loss as one course. Okay. Claudia says I teach it as an elective, but agree it needs to be more integrated. Yeah, interesting. Thank you for sharing that, folks. Okay. All right. So one barrier right off the bat, I think, that we need to kind of contend with is this pervasive myth that professionals, right, we don't show our emotions, right? There's a pervasive myth that emotions maybe don't belong at, quote, work, right? I like this quick little video because I think it dispels that myth really well. So we'll take a peek at that. And then again, we'll pause, kind of dialogue a little bit, and then we're going to kind of move into conversation about how can we change some of this? How can supervision be a space to kind of have some of these conversations? Great. So again, this video is called How to Embrace Emotions at Work. So we can kind of take the work off and maybe say how to embrace emotions in supervision. So let me know what you guys think.
No matter how hard you might try, you can't just flip a switch when you step into the office and turn your emotions off. Feeling feelings is part of being human. A pervasive myth exists that emotions don't belong at work, and this often leads us to mistakenly equate professionalism with being stoic or even cold. But research shows that in the moments when our colleagues drop their glossy professional presentation, we're actually much more likely to believe what they're telling us. We feel connected to the people around us, we try harder, we perform better, and we're just generally kinder. So it's about time that we learn how to embrace emotion at work. Now, that's not to say you should suddenly become a feelings fire hose. A line exists between sharing, which builds trust, and oversharing, which destroys it. If you suddenly let your feelings run wild at work and give people far more information than they bargained for, you make everyone around you uncomfortable, and you also undermine yourself. You're more likely to be seen as weak or lacking self-awareness. So, great to say you weren't feeling well last night. You don't need to go into every lurid detail about how you got reacquainted with your half-digested dinner. So there's a wide spectrum of emotional expression. On one hand, you have under-emoters, or people who have a hard time talking about their feelings, and on the other end are over-emoters, those who constantly share everything that's going on inside. And neither of these make for a healthy workplace. So what's the balance between these two extremes? It's something called selective vulnerability. Selective vulnerability is opening up while still prioritizing stability and psychological safety, both for you and for your colleagues. Luckily, anyone can learn to be selectively vulnerable with practice. Here are 4 ways to get started. First, flag your feelings without becoming emotionally leaky. Bad moods are contagious, and even if you're not vocalizing what you're feeling, chances are your body language or your expressions are a dead giveaway. So if you are crossing your arms or hammering on your keyboard, your coworkers are going to know you're upset. And if you don't say anything, they might start to think it's about them and get worried. So if you are reacting to a non-work related event, so traffic, for example, just flag it. You don't need to go into detail. You can say something as simple as, I'm having a bad morning, it has nothing to do with you. Now, if it's a work-related event that's causing you to feel strong emotions, that brings us to point number 2. Try to understand the need behind your emotion and then address that need. If you suddenly start to find everyone around you irritating, sit back and reflect on that. And it might be that you're irritable because you're anxious, and you're anxious because you're worried about hitting a looming deadline. And in that case, you can go back to your team to address that need and say something like, I want to make sure I get everything done ahead of the deadline. Can you help me put together a realistic plan to do that? If you're thinking of sharing, try and put yourself in the other person's shoes. So if what you're about to say would help you feel more supported and better understand a situation, then go ahead and share it. But if it gives you any kind of pause, you might want to leave it out. And finally, read the room and provide a path forward. If everyone on your team has been pulling long hours and you notice that one of your colleagues seems particularly deflated or anxious, you can acknowledge that and show some empathy, but then try to give them something actionable that they can hold on to. And in this case, you could suggest that you go to your manager and ask that your weekly meeting be pushed back a day so you both have more time to work. You're showing that you're invested in their success, but also that you care about their well-being. When we can be honest about what we feel and freely suggest ideas, make mistakes, and just not have to hide every piece of who we are, we're much more likely to stay at the company for a long time. We're also happier and more productive. So take a moment to reflect on the emotional expression that you bring to work each day. And if you are prone to oversharing, try editing. And if you're a little bit more reserved, look for moments when you can open up to your colleagues and be a bit vulnerable. And chances are, there will be a big difference in how people respond to you. And selective vulnerability might just become one of your most valuable tools.
All right. What did you guys think of that? Thoughts? What's coming up for folks in the context of, let's take some of that content in that video and how might you apply it to counseling supervision? Would love to maybe hear from one or two folks. Again, either in the chat or feel free to just blurt out some thoughts too. What are we thinking? Yeah, Denise says appropriate and brief disclosure so others don't assume you are upset with them, and boundaries. Yeah, I think those are two really helpful things to pull out from that video. Yeah, I liked how the video really balanced, right? The risk, I guess, of oversharing and also kind of the danger of repressing too when you're upset. So how can we kind of find some of those balances? Yeah. Yeah, a balanced permission to express emotions. Absolutely. One thing I pulled out too from this video is we're human, right? And we bring those pieces and parts of ourselves as counselors and counselor supervisors. And I think sometimes we maybe forget those pieces of ourselves, right? Or we're maybe programmed, like, again, that myth, right? That to be professional means to never kind of express those emotions. Okay. All right. So I like these reflective questions, and I think these can facilitate good conversation between supervisors and supervisees. Having a conversation. How do I believe grief should be handled in a professional setting? Do I think it's appropriate for grief to be a part of a professional environment? Again, so these are just reflection questions, okay? What beliefs do I hold about grief in general? Do I have any biases, right? That grief should look a certain way. For example, might I associate grief with tearfulness and only tearfulness? Absolutely, tearfulness is a part of grief. However, just because someone isn't showing tearfulness doesn't mean that they're not grieving, right? Grief can come out in a myriad of ways. Some people will say to me, Kailey, I feel like my chest hurts or my stomach hurts, right? Grief can be felt very somatically, right? Okay. So just thinking through, what are my maybe biases about how grief should look? Okay. Asking yourself as a supervisor, what's my comfort level in supporting folks in grief? Okay. Do I feel like I have the tools I need to walk with my supervisee? Okay, whether my supervisee is experiencing a personal loss or they're counseling a client that has a loss, okay? This question may not be something you want to explore in supervision, but I think it's well worth reflecting on your own time. How was grief handled in my own life? What emotions have I been allowed to process or share? What did that look like in my family of origin looking up, okay? How has grief been handled in prior work settings? I will be kind of transparent and share in my work professionally, even as somebody who specializes in grief and loss and worked in a hospice setting, sometimes there was a sense that, well, Kailey, this is what you do. You should be able to, quote, handle, right? Handle this. And so it became challenging when I had moments, right, where maybe a case really did tweak me, or I did, feel like I need to, this emotion needs to go somewhere, right? So I have to be honest and say that grief hasn't always been handled real well in my work life. Okay, so it's a question worth reflecting on. And again, at your comfort level, I put these questions out there because I think they can be helpful to facilitate conversation with colleagues and in supervision settings. Okay. Again, my overarching theme here is that supervision can hopefully provide a safe space, right, to discuss grief and can counter some of the negative impact of disenfranchised grief, which I will define here shortly. So yes, defining some terms, always helpful. So we're going to kind of talk about how supervision can enfranchise folks in their grief. But first, we need to kind of put some language around, well, what is disenfranchised grief? Okay. So this is Dr. Ken Doka, and he's going to explain this theory. It's his theory, so I always say it's kind of nice to let folks who actually develop the theory kind of speak and explain for themselves. What is it, right? If you wouldn't mind while we're watching the video, though, put in the chat, guys, if disenfranchised grief is a familiar term to you, okay? So just kind of do that while we're listening to Dr. Doka. All right.
Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley, president of the Open to Hope Foundation, and today I have the honor of talking to Ken Doka, and we're going to be talking about disenfranchised grief. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Gloria. How are you?
Great. What is disenfranchised grief?
Okay, disenfranchised grief refers to losses that one experiences that is not openly acknowledged, socially supported, or publicly mourned. For example, we talk about a number of different categories. In some cases, it may be a relationship that's not recognized. Everyone knows to support you when your spouse dies, but you also may grieve an ex-spouse or a partner, certainly. Or all kinds of other relationships in our life. We have lots of relationships in our life, and sometimes we're not even supported when a good friend dies.
So society doesn't see that as the big issue that they do if it's a family member living together.
Yeah, and it may just be involved with what we would consider the hierarchy of loss, what Tony Walter talks about as the hierarchy of loss. There are other situations where losses are unacknowledged, such as divorce or separation. Other situations where maybe the death carries a sense of shame or stigma, or maybe people grieve in different ways than we're expected. So there's a lot of reasons why grief may be disenfranchised.
So now I'm thinking as I'm watching this video, I've just had a loss, and I'm suddenly realizing that maybe the reason people aren't responding to my grief is because they don't get it.
I think that can be the case. They don't get it. They don't, they think, okay, well, a friend died, friends die all the time. But they don't realize the attachment that you've had to this person. Or the loss, as I said, is unacknowledged. And there may be a lot of reasons.
Now, how do I take care of myself if this is going on?
Well, I think the first thing is to validate your own grief, to say, this is a loss, it's my loss, it's an important loss, and I need to mourn and grieve that loss. I think another thing we can do is sometimes, beyond validating our grief, find a way to acknowledge our loss, whether it's a small private ritual or maybe a ritual where we invite some other people. And then finally, I think if we're really struggling with this loss, that's what counseling can be useful for, because there you may be able to find someone who truly can allow you to acknowledge your loss, talk about it, and look how you're dealing with it.
Thank you so much for talking about disenfranchised grief today.
Thank you.
And I'm your host, Dr.
All right. Again, any quick thoughts that folks had? Thank you for putting in the chat. A few of you said yes, you are familiar with the term. A few of you said maybe you had heard it, but weren't quite sure what it meant. And a few people said that they were not familiar. So thank you for sharing that. Claudia says, I'm thinking of losses like miscarriage. Absolutely. People who die in prison. Absolutely. Another great example. Pet loss. Yeah, another great example. Those are great. Thank you guys for including those. Absolutely. So it's any type of loss that I like to say gets pushed to the margins, right? So whether actually, you know what? Let me pull my slide back up and okay, perfect. All right. Because I'm going to give you some additional examples here. Okay. So I like to also say that disenfranchised grief is an empathic failure, meaning something isn't being validated, right? And Dr. Doka talked a lot about people who are experiencing disenfranchised grief need validation. They need to know that what they're experiencing is valid. Notice I didn't say normal, because in my experience in working with grievers, when you say to them, oh, what you're feeling is really normal, it doesn't feel normal, right? Grief doesn't feel normal. And so I'm a little more fond of saying what you're experiencing may not feel normal, but it's valid. Okay. So that validation, I think, can counter this empathic failure. Okay. So what does this look like in a supervision context, right? How can supervisors help enfranchise their supervisees who might be experiencing disenfranchised grief? That's where we're kind of going with this. That's what we're going to talk about. Okay. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. Short but very eye-opening video. Good. I'm glad it was helpful. I'm glad that was helpful. Yeah, just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Awesome. Okay. And feel free. I know sometimes it's nice to have the screen up, but if you want to jump in and use your voice to make comments, that's great too, guys. Okay. So I'm going to kind of walk through how I think practically some of this validation can look. Okay. I've already kind of hit on this, but normalizing feelings, right? Okay. And even though I just said I don't like to use the word normalize, again, I say something as simple as it may not feel normal, right? What you're feeling or experiencing right now, but it's valid. Okay. I can't tell you how many times I'll have a griever say to me, Kailey, I feel like I'm crazy. Yeah. And so I like to say, you're not crazy, you're grieving. So normalizing through the process of validation. One thing I think that comes up when we begin to explore kind of grief and supervision is this idea of parallel process, right? Okay, so how does and how might the grief experienced by my client or my supervisee be parallel to something I've experienced in my own life? Issues of countertransference and transference might come up. I believe that these are not intrinsically negative things. Okay, this kind of circles us all the way back to this idea that there's a myth that we can't show emotion, right? So I don't think transference and countertransference are inherently negative. And in fact, this is another kind of way I'm solidifying my point that supervision can be a validating force, is that it can be a supportive environment to bring these issues up, okay, and to find support. One thing also that I want to spend quite a bit of time here, as much time as we have, right? These hours go quick, but this companioning model of grief developed by Alan Wolfelt, I think, embodies this idea of validation and providing support in a way that I hope is helpful to you guys, okay? Dr. Alan Wolfelt has been in the field of death and dying for 30, 40 years, is a wonderfully kind mentor of mine, has the Center for Loss and Life Transition in Fort Collins, Colorado. And the minute I came across this companioning model, I was instantly captivated by it. And I instantly kind of was intrigued about how can this apply in our roles as counselor educators and counseling supervisors, okay? So this companioning model has 11 tenets, and we're going to go through them, and then we're going to pause and just kind of reflect on them because they're deceptively simple at first glance, but what you'll find is this is hard stuff, okay? But he says companioning is about being present to another person's pain. It is not about taking away the pain. It's about going to the wilderness of the soul with another human being. It is not about thinking that you are responsible for finding the way out. It's about honoring the spirit, not about focusing solely on the intellect. It's about listening with the heart, not about analyzing with the head. It's about bearing witness to the struggles of others. It's not about judging the direction of those struggles. Bearing witness. It's about walking alongside, not about leading. It's about discovering the gifts of sacred silence. It is not about filling up every moment with words. This one's the hardest for me. I'm a very verbal process. It's about being still, not about frantic movement forward. It's about respecting disorder and confusion, not about imposing order and logic. It's about compassionate curiosity, not about expertise. Compassionate curiosity. So what I want to do is I'm going to pull up a PDF version of that. I'm going to have it up, and I want you guys to just reflect on, what do you find unique about these tenets? How do you see them being helpful, either in a counseling setting or in a supervision setting? So I'm going to share that. And I know it's a little hard to read it in a PDF version. I'll try to make it as big as possible. But I'm just going to leave these up here for just about 30 seconds to a minute, so you guys can kind of spend a second reflecting.
Oh, Maya? Maya.
Deborah, did you want to say something? I hear your voice.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, no need to apologize. Just wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything if you wanted to chime in. And I know that was a really quick, down and dirty kind of marathon sprint through those. What do we think though? Claudius, oh, this is the hardest part for my students to learn, to truly be present. Yeah, yeah, without needing to do or say something. I really love the wording of companioning. So do I. Yeah, I do too. Connecting and being present. The students don't have to say the right thing. Yeah, students tend to be incredibly solution focused, and this does not have a solution per se. Absolutely. Yeah. It is hard for students to understand that they don't have to have the answers to get someone out of their grief. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing all of that, guys. Yeah. Tend towards rescuing. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's this model is very different, I think, than some of our other counseling models, which certainly have their space, you know. But sometimes in grief, I think we can't necessarily rescue someone out of that, right? We can't CBT our way through that pain. Yeah. So I include this here. Yeah, Jennifer says, I even still tend to lean towards wanting to take the pain away. Yeah, and I think that's so important to acknowledge too, that even as seasoned clinicians and counselor educators and supervisors, I don't think any of us have this down, right? There are days where I'm like, oh my goodness, I could have been a lot more just present, or I was really too quick to verbalize something and try to rescue someone out of it. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, that this is always a work kind of in progress, right? Yeah. Okay. So the reason I bring this up in this training for grief and supervision is I think supervision can be in a space where we can kind of model this, right? How many times as supervisors do we sometimes feel that we have to have an answer for every supervisee question, right? And certainly there are very crisis-oriented situations that, yes, our supervisees need kind of that quick, here's what we need to do. But let's say you have a client, or you have a supervisee who has a client navigating grief, and they're saying, you know, Kailey, as my supervisor, I don't know how to help this client. I think we can model the I don't know, right? Or model the not having to always have a solution. Okay. So that's why I kind of bring this into the discussion. I think we can model this if we have a supervisee that comes to us with a personal loss, right? I think we can kind of model this companioning model with them if they're coming to us and saying, I'm really struggling with X, Y, or Z. Okay. Any additional thoughts on the companioning tenets? I know it goes quick, but I don't want to rush too fast. Okay. So I have often used this book called The Rabbit Listened to model the companioning tenets for my supervisees and my students. So so you don't have to listen to my voice reading it, I have a video. So we're going to quickly listen to this because I think it's a practical way to model companioning for our supervisees. Again, this is a kid's book called The Rabbit Listen.
One day, Taylor decided to build something new, something special. Something amazing. Taylor was so proud. But then, out of nowhere, things came crashing down. The chicken was the first to notice. Cluck, cluck, what a shame. I'm so sorry this happened. Let's talk about it. Cluck, cluck. But Taylor didn't feel like talking, so the chicken left. Next came the bear. Grr, roar, how horrible. I bet you feel so angry. Let's shout about it. Grr, roar, grr. But Taylor didn't feel like shouting, so the bear left. The elephant knew just what to do. Trumpa-duh, I can fix this. We just need to remember exactly the way things were. But Taylor didn't feel like remembering, so the elephant also left. One by one they came. The hyena, let's laugh about it. The ostrich, go, let's hide and pretend nothing happened. The kangaroo, tis, tis, what a mess. Let's throw it all away. And the snake, shh, let's go knock down someone else's. But Taylor didn't feel like doing anything with anybody. So eventually, they all left, until Taylor was alone. In the quiet, Taylor didn't even notice the rabbit, but it moved closer and closer, until Taylor could feel its warm body. Together they sat in silence, until Taylor said, "Please stay with me." The rabbit listened. The rabbit listened as Taylor talked. The rabbit listened as Taylor shouted. The rabbit listened as Taylor remembered and laughed. The rabbit listened to Taylor's plans to hide, to throw everything away, to ruin things for someone else. Through it all, the rabbit never left. And when the time was right, the rabbit listened to Taylor's plans to build again. I can't wait, Taylor said. It's going to be amazing.
All right. What do we think? Thoughts on that maybe kind of quirky demonstration, I guess, of this validation and companioning presence we're talking about? What are your thoughts? 10 out of 10. It's a great little book, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. I like to ask my clients and my supervisees a lot when they're talking about grief. Who are your rabbits, right? Who are those rabbits in your life that just listen, right? Yeah. Yeah. Jennifer says, I like the page that shows the bunny just sitting there while he shows a large frame of emotion. Yeah. Yeah, having compassion. Mm-hmm. Oh, good. Irma says she loves this book. She's used it with a client. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great one. Cool. Let's keep on going. I know we're making it. Okay. All right. So I want to share a few activities, additional activities that I think can be done with the supervision in a supervision setting and or with a client or in a grief counseling course. So this is called the terrain of grief activity. In this one, you're going to ask your supervisee how they would describe their own or their client's grief, okay? You're going to ask, does it appear like one of the following quote unquote terrains? And ask them to explore their own perceptions of grief using these images. So here's some, okay? So we've got some mountains, we've got some plains, a plateau, a fjord, okay? This is a really, really fun website. There's literally 15 different types of terrain. Let me pull that up for you guys so you can see it. And this is what I use to help folks kind of creatively identify what is their grief experience like. Okay, again, our goal is validating. We're not judging, right, what a person is saying. Oh, yeah, perfect. Okay, all right. So you can kind of see there's plateau, mountains, all sorts of fun stuff. Okay. So here's an example. I had a client one time say, for me, I did this activity and they said, for me, grief has felt like just plains. They identified with that image. They said, it's like, I can't really see anything kind of beyond the land in front of me. It just feels like there's no real exit out of this. It seems never ending. Okay. So for them, kind of felt like this picture. Another activity that I've done with folks, clients and supervisees, I call this my grieving in color activity. So when we started today, I had you kind of do a word association about grief, right? So in a supervision setting, I've had supervisees get out blank pieces of paper. I have markers, and they're just going to write the word grief in the middle. And with different colors, they're just going to do that word association activity through doodling, okay? So they're going to doodle. So let's say they think, when I think grief, I think sadness. So they may do a spoke out here of sadness, right? Okay. Again, we're creating space for validating, right? So no two persons doodle is going to look the same, just like no two person's grief terrain activity is going to look the same. Okay. So I call this my grieving in color activity. So again, this just kind of describes how to do this using a blank sheet of paper. Have your supervisee write the word grief in the center, and then have them spend 10 to 12 minutes, whatever time allotment that you have or makes sense. And they're just going to doodle anything that comes to mind when they think of the word grief, right? So what you'll need as the supervisor, just some paper and art supplies, okay? I'm a huge fan of art interventions that are simple and easy because I'm not an artist. I do a great stick figure, but that's about it. But I love art, and I think using some of these tools can be really helpful in expressing ourselves, right? Another one, and I know this will probably be the last one because we're getting close on time. This one's a little more extensive, and I do think involves a pretty high level of trust between supervisor and supervisee, and this is a loss line. This is actually an assignment I do every year in my grief counseling class, but you're going to have supervisees jot down. Again, they don't necessarily even need to share it with you as their supervisor. They're just going to make a timeline in whatever way they want, and document losses they've encountered. And you're going to encourage them to think beyond just death loss as well, right? They can use different colors to associate the loss with different feelings. For example, the loss of an early move as a child might evoke feelings of anger for your supervisee, right? So they might decide to write that loss in their timeline in red, okay? Again, keep in mind that these interventions do involve a high level of quote unquote trust with supervisor, a reflection question that could be a whole other training, right? How do we cultivate that? Okay, how do we develop that? So here's some additional questions, and this is where we'll kind of end today. By and large, more research, guys, needs to be done on the impact of grief on the supervision relationship, okay? So here are some additional questions that popped into my head as I was putting this together. Are professional losses handled differently than personal losses? Are personal losses deemed as unimportant to discuss in the supervisory space? How can a rocky supervisory alliance negatively impact how a supervisee is able to process grief? Are supervisors, or do they feel comfortable bringing their questions, emotions, and thoughts about grief to their supervisor? Or do they fear that they'll be seen as unprofessional if they do? Okay. So again, throwing out questions and don't necessarily have magic answers for these, but I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of further research, okay? But these were just some things lingering, I guess, in my head. Lots of references for you. And look at that, we made it.
Thank you, Kailey.
Woo, that was fast.
Such a relevant, timely topic, and thank you for engaging all of us in some critical conversation. So just a reminder for those of you who have attended, if you are interested in CEs, you should be receiving an email in roughly a week after you've taken that survey. And then you should get your certificate in 1 to 2 weeks in total time. Our next NCACES webinar is scheduled on November 11th, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I put the contact in the chat for you guys. Somebody asked for it, so feel free to reach out. Have a good weekend, guys.
I have a question about the CEs.
Oh, yeah, that's probably a